Thanks, Henri, for getting us kicked off today. Speaking of accessibility, I love how much space there is for captions at this event. This is amazing. So as you heard, I'm Melanie Richards. I'm a member of the web platform team on Microsoft Edge, and I also participate in standards communities such as the CSS Working Group. So the CSS Working Group has been developing integrations for web developer styling with user system settings, such as Windows High Contrast. And if you're unfamiliar with Windows High Contrast, this is an accessibility feature that is designed to increase legibility while decreasing cognitive load. So the feature works by enabling the user to set colors for a scope number of semantic elements. And then these colors are applied to digital UI. So this essentially pares down the UI while guaranteeing the user's chosen contrast level. And so here we have Windows High Contrast Black rendered, and you can see that everything's pared down and it's white text on a black background. So browsers can also, like other apps, make sure that their UI is rendered in high contrast, as well as web content. And so in parallel to the standardization effort, I was also part of a usability study to determine how well high contrast is working on the web for people. So we had some folks who identify as having low vision go through some sites with and without high contrast enabled. And this one individual, when looking at a site in its original colors, remarked, "The text on the blue background is kind of hard to read." Now, you might hear this and think, okay, maybe this is some kind of shenanigans where the designer, wants the text to be really subtle, like maybe in a footer they have dark text on a dark background. But actually, the person was referring to black text on a white background. You cannot have a higher contrast ratio than this. And still, this individual's eyes were picking up on the blue light in the screen, and they still found it a little bit tricky to read. So we then turn on, a dark high contrast theme, and the same person said, "That's much better." So this is actually the same exact contrast ratio as the previous slide. It's just in a particular color scheme that was easier for this person to read. So in web design and development, we put a lot of energy into making some one true design as beautiful and useful and pleasant for as many people as possible is often our goal. But the truth is, our users bring with them highly individualized needs for color and contrast. And these can change by the day or even the hour. So maybe someone had a recent injury that makes it really hard to look at screens, especially certain colors. Or they find that lower contrast actually helps them focus better. Or maybe they're up in the middle of the night, like trying to jam on a major project without keeping their partner up with the light from their screen. So how are we supposed to manage all these needs and preferences at once with just one color scheme? Well, while we should provide reasonable defaults within our base theme, the truth is that we can take a layered approach to inclusive color and contrast on the web. Using emerging media queries and CSS properties, we can respond to preferences such as preferred color scheme, preferred contrast level, and the presence of forced color modes like high contrast. So we can use these new standards to efficiently tailor our websites to our users' needs, while also maintaining a design point of view. And so let's suppose that we are working on a marketing page for a service that sends you clothing tailored to your individual preferences. And we want to create variations on our theme for our users' benefit. So I'm going to zoom in here real fast. And we essentially have here a light theme that has dark, cool accent colors. We've got some mixed content here, including a sample color palette in this style profile. We've got gradients layered on top of photography, some decorative borders, and form fields at the bottom of the page. So there are a few related media queries that we will use in order to create the variations on this theme. And these are prefers color scheme, prefers contrast, and forced colors. So prefers color scheme is a hint to provide a particular color scheme to the user. So this is highly correlated today with supporting dark mode. And prefers contrast is a hint to either increase or decrease the contrast. Forced colors is a hint that the rendering engine has already applied the user system colors to the web content. And this can occur when Windows High Contrast is active. So there's a couple different expectations on the web developer here. For prefers color scheme and prefers contrast, the expectation is that the website will fully manage the color scheme as well as any contrast levels. And for forced colors, the expectation is that these have already been applied by the browser, and the website might just want to optimize its design. So let's start here by adding an additional color scheme. So as mentioned, prefers color scheme allows the web developer to respond to hints from the user as to which color scheme they might like. So this could be provided on the OS level, checkboxes for light mode or dark mode, or the browser itself could actually support its own color schemes. For example, if the browser is available on an OS that doesn't support dark mode but wants to make this available for its users. So let's suppose that we want to support dark mode here. All right, cool. Fun with clickers. So one strategy that actually makes this way easier is to use CSS custom properties, or known in the common parlance as variables. So we'll basically set, instead of setting static colors all over our pattern library or wherever we have our style sheets, we're actually going to set some color variables on the root node here. So for example, we have BG color main set to white. And so then we can use these throughout our styles instead of or in addition to the static colors. So we'll set our body background to BG color main using the var syntax. And then what we want to do is we want to update these variables for dark mode. So what we're going to do is we're first going to query for prefers color scheme dark. And then we'll set our styles from within. So there's actually nothing that says thou shalt remove all color in dark mode, although it is heavily associated with shades of gray. But in our example, we actually think that the blue color is really important to our brand. So we want to make sure that we're going to do this up in shades of blue with the saturation turned down a little bit, just to make it easier to read in dark mode. So all we're going to do here within our prefers color scheme dark media query is reset the values of these color variables. And so BG color main is now a dark blue color. And this is all we're going to do. We're not going to touch any other lines of code, but these values are going to propagate to wherever that we've used them. So now we have our page rendered in dark blue. And so just by changing the color variable values, we've actually got most of our page styled in a matter of, I think this took me like 10 minutes. So there are some things that we want to manually change. So we didn't use color variables for these gradient images, so we'll just manually change our CSS that way. And after the simple variable swap, we actually think, maybe this box is like too bright, so we'll change that manually as well. And our logo doesn't look that great either. So it's still being rendered in the dark color, and this is an SVG logo. So one of the things that we could do to make sure that this logo is always rendered in the correct color is use current color in the fills and the strokes of the logo. And so basically this will inherit the color from the surrounding context, so it'll get the color of the link. And we're actually going to do this inside of our base theme instead of inside the media query, so that way the color is inherited no matter what color scheme we're in. And that'll pick up the color correctly. So after doing this work to support dark theme across our page here, big bright images might actually end up detracting from what we have. So we might choose to swap out imagery using source set media conditions. But in our case, we've decided, no, actually, the photography that we have here already is really important to our content. So we're just going to tweak it a little bit. So what you could do is you could use the Css Filter property on your images to turn down the brightness a little bit, turn up the contrast a little bit to kind of make sure the colors don't get muddy. And this is a very subtle change, but it does kind of help blend the photography a little bit with the rest of the page. We'll notice that some of our form fields here are actually still rendered in the light mode theme. So in order to fix this, we can use the CSS color scheme property, and we can set that to light dark. And that basically tells the rendering engine that it's safe to render user interactive controls and scroll bars in the dark theme. And we're going to do this on our root node so that it just propagates to our entire document, because we want to support across the document. But actually, if you wanted to, you could do this on individual elements. For example, if you have a use case where you're like, okay, I have some user-generated content in like part of my document. I don't want to color shift that, but I want to color shift the rest of the UI. So that's kind of like a little bit of flexibility that you have there. And so by making this change, now we can have our controls render in dark mode. So we should also pair this with a meta tag that gives the browser rendering engine an early hint as to how it can render a page. And so this can actually help prevent like a flash of white, or it can help mail apps kind of do some auto darkening if they so choose to do so. And so the syntax for this is actually still under discussion in standards, and you can find a reference to that at the short link that I've provided here, so aka.ms/color-scheme-meta. And all these short links just send you over to standards environments. So basically, we've been able to support dark mode on our page using 20 lines of code. And in that number, I include selectors and any changes to the variables that we have here. And we've also changed one line of code. So in additional considerations, you could consider a site level override. It's always possible that someone prefers dark scheme for the rest of their ecosystem, but actually prefers your site in a light color mode. And so I would consider this going the extra mile, but you could have a site setting that allows them to toggle this, and you could have that connected to a CSS selector that basically manages your dark mode styles. So there is pretty good browser support for prefers color scheme media query across modern rendering engines. And the color scheme property and the current meta syntax is available in Safari 12.1 and above. And these metrics are all for desktop. So now that we've got dark mode up and running on our site, let's talk about querying for contrast. So this is a hint that can likewise come from the user's settings on the OS or otherwise. So for example, if you're on Mac OS and you click increase contrast and you're in light mode, you'll notice that the text gets darker and the borders get darker in order to stand out more from the background. So this is something that we could pick up in our web styles. So the proposed syntax here is prefers contrast, and the current values for this are no preference, high, and low. But these values are actually still under discussion because some folks in the CSS working group were like, does this really align with how OS level settings work today? So we might change to a different set of keyword values, or maybe we can consider a numeric value. So for this reason, we're not going to talk too much about contrast today because the guidance to you as web developers might change. But whenever this is available, there's a few things that you might want to focus on adjusting. So this is things like text, non-decorative icons and imagery, backgrounds and decorations on interactive elements, and other design elements that are important to understanding relationships or content. So for some folks, a slight adjustment to contrast or an art-directed color scheme doesn't quite meet their needs for legibility on the web. And this is where forced color modes come in. So the new standards for forced color modes are actually heavily influenced by the Windows high contrast feature, as well as prior art for styling in this in IE and Microsoft Edge. So it should be noted that Windows high contrast is actually somewhat of a misnomer. So while the inbox themes are certainly the most popular, and they do guarantee high contrast, users can actually change these colors to anything that they want. So this can be really helpful if you need colors that are more differentiated from each other, or if actually you want the UI to render in softer contrast. So no matter the reason for choosing Windows high contrast, this is actually far and away one of the most popular ease of access settings on Windows. Last time we checked, it was used on like 4% of active devices, and that actually represents millions of people worldwide. So let's explore how this works under the hood. Excuse me. So we've set the OS into a high contrast black theme, and without doing any work on the web development end, we have our page rendering pretty well in high contrast. So we're getting the white text in the foreground, we're getting a different color for the links, and we have this black background as well. And these colors are shifted throughout the page, including native form controls. And so let's explore how this works under the hood. So first, the rendering engine reverts the values of some properties. And this includes any properties that are related to color, as well as decorations that might interfere with text legibility. So for example, box shadow and text shadow could make it hard to read edges, or they might overlap on top of other elements. So after this reverting of values, then the rendering engine applies the user's colors. And so basically it has its own user agent style sheet where the colors are applied semantically. So link color to link color and all that good stuff. So if we return to our reverted properties, what's important to note here as developers is that if you use a reverted property to denote state, you might want to make some adjustments in force color modes. So for example, if you're using box shadow to denote a focus state. And another interesting point to call out here is that background image is only reverted in user interactive controls with the exception of buttons. And so why not just like globally revert background image? Well, it turns out in historical implementations that did do this, we found that this causes problems when the web developer uses CSS to render content images. So for example, here is a feed of photography. Let the record show there are no visible images on the screen right now. So there's many different reasons why people do this. This in particular was a historical performance hack. So we as rendering engines need to make sure that this content is available to people. And so how do we actually guarantee that text legibility while also showing background images? And the solution that we came up with in Edge HTML, and which will now be part of standard implementations, is to render text backplates behind the text when in force color modes. And so basically, this helps guarantee that the user has the correct colors, and this can be seen on top of anything that the text is layered on top of. So a new detail in standard implementations is that force color modes, or prefers color scheme evaluates appropriately. So what the rendering engine does is it looks at the page background color or the canvas color to determine if the force color mode is light or dark. And then it uses this to evaluate prefers color scheme correctly. So in this case, we're actually picking up in our gradient images here the colors that we set within our dark mode styles, because we're currently in a force color scheme that has a black background. So SVGs are, for the most part, not modified in standard implementations. This is because we as rendering engines don't really always know how these should be shifted for these colors, because SVGs can be very complex documents. So the only pieces of SVG that are color shifted are SVG text, as well as foreign object, which essentially embeds HTML inside of SVG. And so actually, funnily enough, this is why our logo is in the correct color, because in our base styles, we used current color for the strokes and the fills. And so it's actually appropriately inheriting from the system link color that's been provided here. So browser rendering engines can get most of the way there by applying reasonable defaults to semantic content. But web developers know their content best and can apply that content-specific knowledge to tailor the force colors experience. So let's go through how to do that. So you may have noticed when we kind of scrolled through our force color page here that we actually lost some details in the palette of the style profile. And so this is because we're using background image or background color to render the color palettes. So we could change to using images as a strategy, or we could decide, let's just manage this component in force color modes ourselves. So let's go ahead and do that. We have a couple of requirements for our palette and force color modes. So we want to retain the color swatch. We want to make sure that we're always rendering the color swatch on top of black or white. We're doing this because the user can set any color in force color modes, and we want to make sure that the color doesn't look muddy on top of whatever the user might have set. And we also want to preserve the user's color scheme for text legibility. All right, so let's start with our media query. So the prior art for this is the MS High Contrast media query. But in standards, this has been renamed to force colors, and we'll check for the active value. So the reason why we named it this in the CSS working group is to essentially future-proof the feature. We want web developers to be able to very efficiently style for any force color mode, not just high contrast. So then we'll want to opt out of force colors for the component that we're managing. So this comes from the prior art of MS High Contrast Adjust None. And so in standards, this is force color adjust none. And what this will do is remove all of the force colors that the rendering engine has set. It'll basically retain all our colors for the component, its children, and any text backplates that are involved. So you'll notice that our component now looks as it did in dark mode. And so next we want to render the background of this component in black because we're in a dark force color scheme. So we'll just set that to black. But we actually want to be really careful with static values in force color modes. And the reason for this is not so obvious when we are using black in a black color scheme. But if we switch this into, say, a purple user color scheme, then this static color isn't aware of the change that the user made, and it's not rendering things in the user's correct colors. So in order to make sure that the text on top of this is rendering in the user's colors, we're going to use system colors to guarantee legibility. So we're going to essentially create our own backplate here. We'll set the background color of this span here to canvas, and then we'll set the foreground to text. And this way, we are guaranteeing that we're using exactly the colors that the user chose. And now our component is complete as far as dark force colors are involved. So there are a few CSS system colors that are relevant when Windows High Contrast is active. So in addition to text and canvas, there is also link text for links. There's gray text for disabled text. And there's a couple additional keyword values for highlights and for buttons. And these are all up-to-date standard CSS system colors. You can find the full list of CSS system colors on the CSS Color Editor's draft. And the short link for this is aka.ms/system-colors-draft. And you'll notice that there's actually a longer list on here than on the previous slide that I showed. So not every OS will be able to support every single system color. So it's important that whenever you use these values that you test your content. So as we mentioned, we want to either always render the background of our component in black or white. And so we see that when we put the force color mode in a light color scheme, we get the correct colors again for our text. But the black background in the component is actually, it's a little too much in this mode, right? So we want to change this to white in this case. So what we can do is take a combinatorial approach in the new standards to modifying this. So we can query for force colors active and prefers color scheme light, because that media query gets evaluated appropriately. And then we just set our colors within this combinatorial media query. So elsewhere in our page, we are actually missing a little bit of detail here. So in our base styles, we set the style of the button to border 0 because we're using background color to display this. But this causes problems in force color modes, for example, where the background color and the page background color are actually the same. You can't see the bounds of this button, so the user doesn't know exactly where to click or even if it is a button. So in order to fix this, we can just change in our base styles the border to 1px solid transparent. And so essentially here we're guaranteeing that we get the design that we wanted in our base theme, so the border is invisible. But in this force color mode, we are appropriately getting the border drawn. So in additional considerations, browsers aren't really in the business today of changing styling by default based on ARIA roles and properties. So the expectation is that if you're using ARIA to provide your own semantics on a component, then you are also managing keyword accessibility and styling as well. And so this actually applies today in force color modes as it does in default contexts. So you might want to test if you're using any styling that's connected to ARIA. So unless you do a whole lot of creating your own semantics and states and your own custom components, we actually expect that the work that you'll have to do with optimizing for force color modes is like pretty minimal. So I actually just threw a ton of information at you, but it's worth noting that we only wrote 12 lines of code for the new standards over these past slides, and I'm including selectors in that number of lines. And we've got our page styled up. We also changed one line in the base theme as well. So as far as browser support goes for force color modes, the prefixed values are still supported in IE and Microsoft Edge today. And that's versions of Microsoft Edge that are based on Edge HTML. And I make that distinction because the new standards are in development in Chromium for new versions of Microsoft Edge, as well as the entire browser community that is based on this particular rendering engine. And we hope that we will be joined by other rendering engines as well in the future. So it is worth noting that these standards are super new. We've been working on them in 2019, but we think that they'll be imminently ready for folks to start playing around with behind a flag soon. So if you're testing without a Windows machine, you can find free virtual machines at akms/web-vms. And in the future, cross-platform browsers may consider possibly having some dev tools that could spoof force color modes from directly within the browser. And this would mean that you wouldn't need a Windows machine at all, or you wouldn't have to push your entire machine into high contrast mode in order to test these values. So just show of hands, would anybody be interested in such a dev tool feature? All right, cool. We got some hands throughout. I hope you do get to test your content in a force color mode, such as high contrast, because while we as browsers can get most of the way there, you are the expert on your content and can deliver a truly well-tailored experience on top of the web platform. So these emerging CSS media queries and CSS properties can allow us to meet our users where they are. Whether they find that dark mode helps them cut down on eye strain, or they need a very specific color scheme in order to stay productive on the web, we can really give them an inclusive and delightful experience. So with these new standards in hand, let's design a more inclusive and accessible web together. You can find my slides, my demo, and other resources at akms/view/color. And thank you very much.